Hi everyone. So this week we are covering the topic of family and marriage. And as you'll see as we discuss the various components of family and marriage in the context of sociology, we're going to be building on a lot of the topics that we've covered thus far, specifically things including socioeconomic status and social class, definitely gender, race, etc., as they all kind of intersect uniquely in this institution of family and marriage. So what is a family? Well, the US Census Bureau defines family as a group of two people or more, one of whom is the householder, related by birth, marriage, or adoption, and residing together. So this is the definition, a working definition that is used by the census in the United States. But as you're reading through this, maybe for some of you, this is kind of rising a red flag. So I'd like you to think for a second, in your own words, how do you define family? And according to your own definition of family, who counts as a family member and who doesn't? Now, if we'd be meeting face to face, I would actually ask you all to write down your own definition and then actually compare it with the person sitting next to you so we can compare and contrast how your definitions of family are both similar and different. Almost certainly, you would share some ideas about who counts as family members in terms of the conditions that you developed in your own definition. But almost equally certainly, we would see that you have some variance across definitions. So since we can't do this in class, I have an exercise here on the slides, which I'm not going to go through in the video, but I will post the slides, of course, on Blackboard along with the video lectures for today. And you can do this exercise on your own to get a good understanding about how you specifically define family, because it's a very subjective experience for many of us. So essentially what this exercise is that I show 10 different cases on the 10 following slides of different groupings of people. And for each one of these groupings of individuals, I want you to decide whether or not you personally would define this particular group of people as a family. If you think yes, the group does refer to a family, you would give yourself 1 point. If you were not sure if you'd qualify that group of people as a family, you'd give yourself 2 points. And if you think no, this group of people does not represent a family, you give yourself 3 points. All right. And so the idea behind this is that you keep track of your points for each of these 10 slides, and then you add up your 10 scores of those slides, and you're going to get a base number. All right. And so I'll tell you more about what that base number means in just a minute. I'm just going to advance through these slides right now. And again, you can go through these slides on the actual PowerPoint when I upload it onto Blackboard. All right, so as you hopefully will read through all of those different scenarios, they represent a really broad spectrum of groupings of people who may or may not qualify as a family according to your own personal definition. So as you tally up your scores again, with 1 equaling yes, you think that is a family, 2 equaling you're not sure, and 3 equaling no, you do not think that's a family, you'll end up with the score ranging somewhere between 10 and 30. Now, the lower your score is, so the closer your score is to 10, the broader your personal definition of family is. On the flip side of that, the higher your score is, so the closer to 30 your score is, the more narrow your definition of family is. Now, what this means in terms of broad or narrow definitions, if you have a really broad term of family, you're likely going to include people in your definition of family that maybe aren't related through marriage, aren't related through bloodlines, maybe aren't related through adoption, maybe people who are very, very close friends of yours you would constitute as family. Maybe some of you count pets of yours as family. Maybe some of you have mentors or teachers or coaches that played a really meaningful life in your upbringing and you constitute them as family. And notice that in all of those situations, whether it's friends, pets, or mentors, those people aren't legally going to be related to you, right? They're not going to be related to you through bloodlines. They're definitely not your parents. So some people will count those individuals as family. Other people would say, no, in order to be considered family, you really do need to be related through either marriage, bloodlines, adoption, some sort of legal structure, etc. But other people are going to be a lot more inclusive and broad with their definitions of family. And again, what this exercise gives evidence to is that family is also something, as you may have guessed, that is socially constructed in our society, meaning that we as a society decide who counts and who doesn't count as family, right? And as we talk about this concept of family, this institution of family, we're going to see that a lot of our definitions of family are heavily influenced by the law, right? Laws that are in place that legally define who counts as family. But even though we have those laws in place, we'll still recognize that there is this kind of personal and subjective element to defining family, right? Some of you may count your best friends that you've had since childhood to be a member of your family, even though legally you aren't related, even though you're not related through blood. You might still count those close friends as family members, and that might affect the way that you interact with them. It might affect the way that you treat them in everyday interactions. So from a sociological perspective, we're very interested in better understanding how individuals define families in juxtaposition to the legal definitions provided for family in any given society. So is there a right or wrong definition of family? No, of course not. It's something, again, since it's socially constructed, it's something that we as a society create, but there definitely is an individualistic and subjective element into defining family, because each one of us, depending on the way we were socialized and depending on the environments that we were raised in, have been taught to define families in different ways. So can we have more than one possible definition of family? Yes, certainly we do. But one thing I do want to raise to the attention of everyone is that the process of creating a definition really requires us to consider the requirements and the restrictions that are put in place specifically by the society that we live in. And as individuals living in society, remember, especially thinking with our sociological imaginations, our favorite question as sociologists is why? Why are certain requirements and restrictions put in place to define who counts as a family? And subsequently, a follow-up question that a sociologist would ask is, what are the repercussions of having legal restrictions defining family? You know, who gets left out in certain cases? And we'll talk more about that later. But, you know, what are requirements for family? You know, does marriage need to be in place for a couple to be considered a family? What about a couple that's been in a relationship together for 50 years, cohabitating, living together, but never got married? Do they not count as family? Well, according to the legal definition in most states, no, they would not, which means that they wouldn't have access to literally over 1,000 legal benefits and privileges that are associated with the institution of marriage. You know, other things. Does a couple need to have children to be considered a family? Does a couple need to be in love, or do family members need to love one another in order to be considered family? Do we need some other legal form of documentation, you know, adoption papers, a marriage certificate, etc.? Do they need to share bloodlines? Does a family need to live together? You know, can you be in a relationship with someone but be long distance and only see each other a couple times a year and still be considered a family? You know, these are all sociologically driven questions that scholars of family and marriage are interested in exploring from a sociological perspective, and we're going to touch on many of these different questions in this particular presentation. So the census definition of family, I think, is a bit narrow, a bit restrictive from a sociological perspective, because it really emphasizes the need to either be legally recognized as a family, either through marriage or some sort of adoption or legal practice, or to be related through bloodlines. And of course, that leaves out a lot of people that many of us would consider family. Like I said, really close friends that we may have, mentors, colleagues, etc., that we spend a lot of time with or have developed really intimate relationships with. So we're going to use this definition of family in this class because I think it's a little more sociologically oriented. So a family consists of relationships by blood, marriage, or affection in which members may cooperate economically, may care for children, and or may consider their identity to be intimately connected to the larger group. So this definition, definitely a little more clunky, you know, a little more jargon and clauses in it, but I think this kind of complex definition is necessary to accurately represent the complexities of marriages and families today. Because as we'll talk about, families and marriages are becoming increasingly diverse today, especially in US society, and we're going to look at a number of examples to demonstrate the complexities of marriage and family, which is why I think, again, this more complex definition of family is more appropriate. So families today, who counts? Well, one of the most comprehensive studies that have been conducted on family and marriage and public attitudes toward them was conducted 10 years ago now. And as you can see here, in 2010, 99.8% of Americans, so literally almost 100% of Americans, agreed that a husband, a wife, and children counted as a family. But that number dropped as families started to become more variegated. So, for example, a husband and wife with no children, 92% of people thought that was a family. An unmarried couple with children, only 83% of people thought that was a family. An unmarried couple without children, less than 40% of people considered that particular grouping of people to be a family. A gay male couple with children, 64% of people thought that was a family, and gay male couples without children, only 33% of people considered that to be a family. Interestingly, 60% of US respondents agreed that if you consider yourself a family, you are a family. So, this is an interesting kind of counterpoint to this here. 60% of adults thought that as long as you consider yourself to be family with someone, regardless if you're legally recognized as family, regardless if you're related through bloodlines, if you think you're family with someone, then you are family with that person. And so that's kind of cute and warm and fuzzy to think of it that way. But as we're going to talk about throughout this presentation, being legally recognized as a family member or being legally recognized as being married to someone carries a lot of consequences in our society, because legally being recognized as a family member or as someone's spouse, as we'll talk about, affords you a lot of benefits and privileges in our society. And of course, we can start to raise some questions about how the restrictions on defining who counts as family, who counts as a spouse, has impacted certain groups in our societies, particularly in US throughout US history. And we can start to see some of the inequalities that have arisen from these kind of narrow definitions of who counts as family. So let's talk about different types of families. The nuclear family is a term that refers to a family consisting of married parents and their children. As of 2010, only 66% of children live in a household with two married parents, which is down from 77% in 1980. This concept of the nuclear family gained a lot of attention in sociology after World War II. So post-World War II, families were separated for many years, right? A lot of men particularly were flown overseas, fighting in active combat, leaving women at home by themselves. So when men came back after World War II, we experienced what was called the baby boom, right? And during the baby boom, of course, we saw this huge upsurge in pregnancies, this huge upsurge in fertility rates, because after the war, people were very much focused on family. They were separated, couples were separated for many years, and it resulted in people having a lot of children. And this kind of nuclear family ideal emerged as a result of the baby boom. This idea of the male breadwinner, the female homemaker, and who's the mother stays at home with the children, etc., etc. And that idea of the nuclear family of two married parents and children kind of became solidified in the media as being the norm or the expected family formation in the United States. So if you think of a lot of TV programming coming out of the 50s and 60s, right? Things like Leave It to Beaver, The Brady Bunch, etc. Programs like that, they really emphasize the importance of this nuclear family as being the normative family structure in the United States. However, since the 1960s, we've started to see a slow decline in the prevalence of that nuclear family formation, as this data suggests. Currently today, 27% of children live with a single parent, 23% live with a single mother, 3% live with a single father. The remaining 1% probably lives with a grandparent or another guardian that is not the father or the mother of the child. So this norm of the nuclear family, like I said, has been constantly on the decline. We also, in addition to having nuclear families, have what are referred to as extended families, which consist of a nuclear family, so parents and their children, plus additional relatives such as grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, etc. We also have the terms family of orientation and family of procreation. An individual's family of orientation refers to the family in which one is born into, while the family of procreation is the family an individual makes through marriage, partnering, and or parenthood. So everyone is born into a family of orientation, right? You have biological parents that birthed you. That is your family of orientation. Families of procreation are the families that we, as the name suggests, create through relationships such as partnering, marriage, and or producing children of our own. Let's talk a little bit about different types of families. We also recognize often in U.S. society fictive kin, which refers to non-relatives, so people that we're not legally related to or related to through bloodlines, but maybe really close friends that we have or families of choice, whose intimate relationships with us and the bonds we create are really strong. So examples of fictive kin might include unmarried couples and very close friends that you have. Also, like I said before, if you had coaches, mentors, or teachers growing up that you were really, really close with, you might also consider them to be fictive kin. Inclusion of fictive kin in defining family has become more acceptable as diverse intimate relationships and untraditional living arrangements have become more common in our society.